Thank you, Professor Rashila, for your talk and detailing out and explaining about Islamophobia as an issue and a problem in the current global Muslim world. As Professor Ebrahim Moosa as well mentioned about yesterday, when it comes to threat, they are always external and they are always internal. And the description on Islamophobia serves to explain to us some of the problems from the external part for among Muslim societies. To move forward to our third speaker today, of course, there is Professor Clive Kessler. He is now Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of New South Wales, and he has written extensively, including a lot of matters related to Islam and Muslim societies in Malaysia. Without further delay, Professor Clive Kessler.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, IRF, and thank you, G25. You probably won't thank me when I've finished, because what I have to say is probably exactly what you don't want to hear. Now, we have the question then of Islam in global politics, a civilizational crisis. How one answers this question depends partly on how you define the terms, but more than that, it depends upon how, with what attitude you see and approach the question that you see those words together as posing. Now, Islam in global politics, so the question depends much on the attitude that you adopt, how you approach it, whether on the one hand, for example, you see it as being about Islam, Muslims asserting themselves in, imposing themselves and their agenda upon global politics, or whether, on the other hand, you see it as Islam and Muslims within, finding their world historical place within, and engaging respectfully with diverse, plural, and in significant measure non-Muslim global humankind, in and as part of a sincere effort by all to find, to negotiate, to establish ways of sharing the world, decently and constructively sharing the world. Now, these clearly are two radically different and contrasting approaches and attitudes. One simply is egotistic, immature, narcissistic, akin to an infantile me tantrum. It rests upon a childish notion that sees only oneself as real and others as merely the sociocultural backdrop, the historical context of one's own needs, one's own agenda, or as people these days say, one's own narrative. The other approach, the other alone, is mature, humane, constructive, and exceeds the bounds and frameworks of infantile wish fulfillment drives. Now, I say this in general. Let's get specific. Islam in global politics. There is today no more high-profile and urgent instance of it than, how shall we call it? Let's call it the Jerusalem question. And there are two parts to this problem, and they are not the same. They are related, but not one and the same thing, and therefore both must be clearly understood and both must be resolved. The fate of humankind may depend upon getting the answers right, and you will not get the answers right if you mess up the questions to begin with. If you confuse the two questions, blur the difference between them, collapse the one into the other. There are two questions. One is the question of Palestinian national political sovereignty and statehood. In, meaning somewhere in some substantial part of, in inverted commas, Palestine. The claim to statehood is undeniable, and there cannot and will not be peace without it. Like many people, I take this to mean a Palestinian state alongside and living constructively with Israel, in other words, the so-called two-state solution. And as I say, I think there can be no peace without it. Now, the second question is the question of the future of Jerusalem. And again, unless this question is resolved wisely and constructively in its own proper terms, there can be no peace. There can be no peace without wise, historically informed solutions to these two questions and florid, florid rally rhetoric notwithstanding, they are not the same question. Now, on the first question, and I won't say very much because the more I say, the less welcome I'll make myself, but the question of Israel-Palestine, a two-state solution implies that you recognise and accept a state of Israel there. De facto, it happens to exist as a matter of fact, and in some sense it has some kind of right to be there that has to be negotiated, sought out and understood. Now, and one has to be careful about one's words, the language one uses. I see repeatedly in the paper here that Israel is repeatedly referred to as Negara Haram. Now, and I simply think you have to ask yourself when you use that term, haram, in what sense is it a forbidden, an illegal, an immoral state? It was, after all, a state that was created, you may like it, you may not like it, it was created by, under a decision of the United Nations and as a member state of the United Nations. And no state should really be in the business of undermining a world order that is a world order of nation states, as the name United Nations itself suggests. And I think Malaysians should, perhaps better than some other people, understand this. When Malaysia was proposed, the expansion in 1961, Indonesia declared internationally that the Malaysian idea was a Negara Haram. And in some sense, one can argue, the status of Malaysia in international law in 1961-63 was no stronger than that of Israel as a Negara Haram today. So I think one has to work out what one means by haram. If you're going to, sorry, I'll get a glass. If you're going to borrow this religious idiom and language, you have to be very clear about what you're doing and what the implications are. Now, second, there is an idea, one can say that in many ways there is a certain incomprehension of or hostility to the idea of an Israeli Jewish nationhood that comes from within an Islamic lens or prism or perception, because Islam sees Jews and Judaism as a relic, in some sense, of the pre-Islamic religious history, the spiritual history of humankind. But that once the Prophet Muhammad came, then Judaism became incorporated in Islam, was obsolete, and if Jews wanted to go on living in the world, that was their business. They had right to their own peculiarities. But from that point of view, Judaism ceases to have any continuing religious legitimacy, and Jews and Judaism have no further history, they have no further part in world history other than within the history of Islam. And this makes it very, very difficult for people to accept the idea that, well, we may think that this is the case as Muslims, but the people themselves don't see things that way, and they have gone on living a history outside of Islam, and a history that has to be understood in its own terms. Going beyond that, then people will suggest that, well, look, it may be like that, but in principle, but there is no, if the Jews want to have a state of their own, well, why is it there in Palestine or Israel? And they say they just came after 1948. This ignores the fact that there has been, despite Roman efforts to clear the land, for example, in 70 and 132 of the Common Era, there's been a continuing Jewish presence in that part of the world since biblical times. It's been greater, it's been lesser, but for a long time, there's been a Jewish presence. It has been part of Jewish history. Not others have had a history there too, but Jews also. Now, on the one hand, we find these days that the OIC gets UNESCO to pass resolutions to say that Jerusalem specifically and Palestine, Israel, there is no Jewish history, and there's no history of any Jewish presence whatsoever in that part of the world. It's all fictitious and false. Now, interestingly, we know far more about world scholarship, archaeology, history, knows far more about the 2,000 years of history of that part of the world before, from 1400, before the Common Era to 600, than we know about Mecca at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, about which we know very little. And speaking from the archaeological point of view, we are very unlikely ever to learn very much, since the Saudis, with their Wahhabi anti-idolatry views, are determined to remove as much of the historical traces that exist of historical Mecca and to replace it with to reconstruct it as a vast religious pilgrimage and religious tourism site surrounded by the appropriate accommodation and parking facilities. So, on the one hand, it is an inconsistency, on the one hand, to say that there is no Jewish well, don't take my word for it that there was a Jewish presence there. Take the word of Islamic history itself. You cannot say on the one hand that there was no Jewish presence there during Hellenic, Persian, Babylonian, Byzantine, and then subsequent Islamic and times. You cannot on the one hand say there is no Jewish presence there, and on the other say, and just look how good the Caliph Omar was to the Jews of Jerusalem when he captured the city in 638, and look how gracious and generous and noble Salahuddin al-Ayyubi was when he conquered the city in, when was it, 1187, am I right? In other words, as they say in French, des deux choses l'une, one or the other, you can't have it both ways. Now, this gets into another point, which I won't go on to very much, but they say, yes, but it's all a Zionist project. And Zionism has a very peculiar meaning in this country. I mean, the history of Jews in Europe and outside Europe is the history of in the 19th century, is the history, as with so many other peoples, of linguistic and cultural and historical groups in an age of nationalism redefining their identity, reinterpreting their whole history in national terms with a nationalist narrative in the age of nationalism. And that is what many Jews who were displaced by the other emerging nations in Europe in the 19th century, in the 18th and 19th century, did. And their particular notion of nationalism, if every nation looked for a homeland, a state, where it was ancestrally based, there were historical memories that took Jewish historical memory back to Israel-Palestine, back to Jerusalem, back to the central mountain on Jerusalem, known in Jerusalem as the Mount of Zion. And Zionism then became the notion of the nationalist movement with an idea of historical return. Now, this is not the idea that you get in this country where, because the notion of an autonomous Jewish history for some 200 to a couple of thousand years, realising a Jewish nationalist movement in the 19th century, that because that becomes, that does not fit within the perceptual prism and lens, the vacuum has been filled by this document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which says that there is a worldwide Jewish conspiracy to control the world by financial and manipulation and financial control. This is an idea that was taken up, this idea was a Tsarist, is well known, a discredited Tsarist forgery of the 19th century, devised by the Tsarist secret police to help maintain Tsarist absolutism and to create anti-Jewish feeling as a way of doing it. It is widely known as a forgery, as a falsehood, but it was taken up by Henry Ford in his publication in a newspaper article, so then got republished as The International Jew. And I will say no more about it, but these books, together with Mein Kampf, which are very, very hard to buy anywhere else in the world, I have to say, are clearly, they must be bestsellers in this country, because it's very hard to go into a bookshop, and I'm not just talking about oddball, corner, neighbourhood, backstreet bookshops. I'm talking about the major book chains and booksellers of this country. It's impossible to go into these bookshops and not to find versions, including new versions, in English and in Malay of Henry Ford's works and of Mein Kampf on sale. Somebody is buying these, and one has to say this suits somebody's purpose, and I think people need to ask why. Okay, now I've said that, which has probably been more than enough to make myself extremely unpopular. That is the one question I think that has to be resolved, and it's the bigger question. It ought to be the more difficult one, except it's the second question that is made more difficult by people's inability to think about it clearly and straightly. Brings us to the second fateful question, the question of Jerusalem. Some basic facts. In Jerusalem on Mount Zion stood Solomon's and later Herod's temple, the so-called in Hebrew Beit HaMikdash, the holy house, the sacred building. It was part of the focal part, but just a part of Zion, the mountain, where the Haram al-Sharif also stands, and Jerusalem. In time, this Hebrew designation, Beit HaMikdash, was borrowed and absorbed into our usage as Baitul Muqaddis to designate old historical Jerusalem generally, not just the temple site itself, the so-called Old City or Eastern Jerusalem. And until the late 19th century, that was pretty much all that there was there. The term Baitul Muqaddis only ever designated that and no more. So it is a misnomer now to use the term as an inflated and expanded sense as the name for the entire area that surrounds the Old City, beyond the Old City. From the 1880s, a different city began to grow up to the west of the Old City. That new city, West Jerusalem, has since shortly after the 1948 war ended, in armistice has been the seat of the government of Israel. That is where its parliament, its main courts are located, and have been now for almost 70 years. And the use of Baitul Muqaddis, the term to refer to and designate as a synonym or equivalent for the modern 20th and 21st century city Jerusalem, including West Jerusalem in its totality, is a fudge, a linguistic fudge, a distortion, a mischief-creating manoeuvre. It is a nomenclatural land grab, territorial expansion by non-consensual terminological innovation. Now, any proposal now, even a ham-fisted, ill-advised and untimely proposal by one Donald Trump, who fortunately is not my president, or that of most of us here, I'm sorry, but some of you have to take responsibility. Any proposal, even a ham-fisted, ill-advised and untimely one by Donald Trump, to recognise the large new city in West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is not a decision to place or shift that capital to East Jerusalem, the old city, or to build foreign embassies there. All else aside, there simply is no space to do so, nor any political possibility of doing so. The old city, East Jerusalem, is, and this is where I come to the point, and is generally understood to be a place of densely packed, overlapping, historically profound sanctities, holiness, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic. These sanctities, the different historical notions of Jerusalem's special holiness, its sacred character and sanctity, are ultimately incommensurable. That is to say, each is what it is in its own terms, and much as we'd like to try and fold them all together somehow, reconcile them, they cannot be brought together, amalgamated, assessed, and ranked against one another in any single scale. Not that any one of these three faiths and faith-based civilizations, and not upon any one of any subsequent synthetic scale. They are all, each is sui generis, each has its own authenticity in its own terms, terms which are ultimately its and its alone. A clear implication follows from this. What this means is that these overlapping and intertwined but different autonomous sanctities must be recognised. And on that basis, on the basis of that recognition of these intertwining and overlapping religious histories and sanctities, a way must be found to manage the old city or East Jerusalem or Baitul Muqaddis on a shared cooperative basis in everybody's interests and with respect for the religious sensibilities of all. This is in fact precisely what the United Nations 1947 partition proposal suggested, that historical Jerusalem should be a corpus separatum, a discrete and separate entity apart from both the new states Israel and Palestine, that its special status should be guaranteed and upheld under international auspices. Israel was wary of this idea, fearing that it would evolve the way UNESCO's policy towards Israel has, and into a malign beast. But Israel was never put to the test on this proposal. The Arab negotiators and politicians rejected it outright. They would settle for nothing less than the whole thing. The old city, Jerusalem, is now largely under Israel state administration, but the religious management of the Haram al-Sharif area is carried out under agreements ultimately with the Jordanian state and royal authorities by the Islamic Waqf. This agreement has survived many boisterous vicissitudes of politics, and it is by agreement. It's important to note here that there was no state in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, when those areas were militarily occupied by Jordan in 1947-48, largely, be it noted, to preempt any possibility, as the British Mandatory Authority withdrew, of any autonomous independent Palestinian state emerging, being created there. That is to say, Jordan held those areas by occupation and conquest, not duly in international law. And when the Six-Day War broke out in 1967, Israel called to tell their friend King Hussein to stay out of it, since the Egyptian airports had been defeated in the war by the morning of the first day was already lost. Hussein called Nasser to ask if what the Israelis said was in fact true. Nasser said no and gave Hussein his solemn word to that effect. Hussein accepted Nasser's assurance. On that basis, he attacked Jewish West Jerusalem from the eastern city. As we know, Jordan was soon defeated, and the old city, including its old Jewish quarter, which the Jordanians had conquered and cleared in 1948, minus its old synagogues, which had all been destroyed, fell into Israel's hands, which is how we got to where we are today. It bears noting here that as a consequence of the Jordan's attack on Israel in 1947, Israel's holding of East Jerusalem since then has a stronger foundation in international law, perhaps, than Jordan's claimed ownership of it, of the city after 1948 ever did. In summary, in conclusion, there are two core issues here, and both must be resolved if the conditions for peace are ever to be established. They are Palestinian statehood alongside and in constructive cooperation with Israel, the two-state solution, and the status and shared management of the old city, East Jerusalem, the Beit al-Muqaddis area, with all its deep historical and religious significance and plurally sacred character. Both must be resolved if a continuing world crisis is to be ended and peace achieved. And though related, these are two different questions, not one. Hence the appalling inadequacy and reckless foolishness of collapsing the two things together into one. For example, a Save Salamat Khan Beit al-Muqaddis slogan and agenda. Palestinian statehood must be achieved and recognised, and a separate matter, some agreed negotiated basis for the cooperative sharing and administration of the old city, East Jerusalem, Beit al-Muqaddis, with its many and richly varied sacred sites, including the Temple Wall, Mount Zion, the churches, Stations of the Cross, Via Dolorosa, the Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of Umar, and the Al-Aqsa, must be devised and made to work. A negotiated arrangement must be devised for sharing Jerusalem that recognises its religious sanctity, deep historical significance to Judaism, Christianity, to Islam, and to the peoples and nations born of them from within their faith communities. Now, if you think that's a tough ask, if you don't want to take this, if you don't like that, you have another option. And that you're left with, a poor alternative, a question. You're left with a question: does Islam, do Muslims have an absolute and exclusive right to Jerusalem to decide what is to become of the triply holy city, and how? And if you take that option, Muslims will have to find arguments justifying that position that not only please them, but which will convince everybody else, the entire non-Muslim world. I'm almost over. I say there are two questions, and anyone who does not see both issues, the second as well as the first as necessary, does not really want peace. They may think they do, but they don't. They do not even know what wanting peace means, which amounts to the same thing. So, as for Islam in global politics, a civilizational crisis, possibly with a question mark, I have offered this case of the Jerusalem question as an example of the problem. I began by posing the question of Islam's and Muslim engagement with global humankind. How? On what basis? On the basis of playing a self-absorbed and myopically focused Islamic politics on a global scale, to project an intellectually unself-critical Islam and assert its agenda as a global political project, to make Islam the new global order or its basis. If that is the case, if that is it, then all one is talking about is at best a soft sell Hizb ut-Tahrir or a ISIS-Daesh light. Or is something else possible and needed? What is the challenge? To face that challenge, Islam really needs to understand itself, not just in its own preferred customary terms, but in terms of the world history of which it is a part and which in so many ways has shaped it. The crisis of Islamic civilization, it seems to me, is that it does not know itself historically, that it does not wish to know itself, and that so many parts of it, it rejects and resists knowing and refuses to know itself in this way. A global Islamic politics and a global order shaped by an Islam that does not know and will not understand itself is not a pleasant prospect for anybody, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, to contemplate. It is not just a fateful question for Islamic civilization, it is one for human civilization as a whole, a question of civilization or a nighttime of barbarism. Thank you.